There we go. Cool, so I hope everyone can hear me and see me okay. I can see some lovely faces nodding at me, which is wonderful. And guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight at the Connection Cafe. For those of you I don't know yet, my name is Liz and I'm Head of Wellness at More Yoga. And tonight we're going to take you through just an open discussion with myself, Charlie and Steph, who are all yoga therapy teachers in different elements and in different ways. And we're going to talk to you about what yoga therapy is and kind of demystify some common questions around it. And then we'll tell you a little bit about our MoreMind program and how we're offering yoga therapy through More Yoga. So I will just let one more person in. And I will introduce first the lovely Stephanie Minchin, who co-runs the MoreMind program here at More Yoga with me. So Steph, I'm just going to spotlight you. You'll come on the screen. If you can just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Hi, my name's Steph, and I'm supposed to share a little bit about my professional background. Firstly, I'm a psychologist. I work in mental health services, mainly in East London with children, adolescents and families. And about 6 years ago, I did my yoga teacher training, and as I was juggling those two different professions, I started to notice how the yoga and psychology were both mirroring and complementing one another. So therein lies my kind of pursuit of yoga therapy. So the last 2 or 3 years I've been training yoga therapy, and yeah, that's where I'm at now, sort of blending those practices between yoga, psychology and yoga therapy.
Thank you, Steph. And Steph also, swap back, co-runs the MoreMind program with myself at More Yoga, which is a program that we've been developing for 2 years to help offer our community, as well as our teachers, a way to support their holistic health and well-being. So looking after your mental health as well as your physical health, spiritual health and emotional health, as I think we all agree that we need to start seeing health in a more holistic, grounded fashion rather than it being separate as the physical, the mental and the emotional. And I will just introduce you to Charlie. I'll just spotlight your video. There we go, my love.
Hello everyone, I'm Charlie, nice to meet you. I am a mental health therapist and yoga teacher and NLP coach. So I work mainly either one-to-ones with people or more in the corporate sector, so with businesses or with groups, offering either elemental yoga therapy, which you'll learn a little bit more about in a moment. My background initially started in neuroscience and psychology, so I did my bachelor's and my master's in that. And I started then applying the principles of that to yoga and acupressure. And similar to Steph, where you can kind of merge things together, I started seeing that using this holistic approach had a greater impact on change for individuals. So trying to apply all of these elements and creating more of a wholesome practice for people to work on what it is that they're working on. So that's what made me form into my business offering therapy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie. And in terms of yoga therapy, I teach yoga therapy specifically for anxiety. And I'm also a holistic wellbeing coach. So I work with people one-to-one and in groups to help people use yoga as a therapeutic tool to help aid the symptoms and alleviate anxiety. And I thought tonight, just to help us all come together and ground, even though we are kind of disconnected physically, to bring us all together mentally and emotionally, to firstly just take a comfortable seat wherever you are, close the eyes down and just take a few grounding breaths together to just bring us together. I'm also really grateful to Charlie and Steph for joining us tonight from Switzerland and from Turkey. So we're coming in from all over the world this evening. So wherever you are in the world right now, whatever has happened throughout your day, guys, just close the eyes down. And let's just take a few deep grounding breaths to just bring us all together and help us all to feel a little bit more present. So taking a deep breath into the nose and sighing out gently through the mouth. Taking a deep breath into the nose, sighing out through the mouth, and taking one more deep breath in. A long exhale out. And just mentally putting any to-do lists or distractions to one side. And allowing yourself to just become present for our session this evening. And when you're ready, just slowly blinking your eyes back open. And coming back into the room. So the format for our discussion tonight is we're going to go through 5 topics, if we have time, around describing what yoga therapy is. And then we'll finish with an open discussion so that there's time for some questions. If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask. So do feel free to jot down questions that we can then come back to at the end of our event this evening. And our first topic of discussion is defining yoga therapy. So Charlie, I will direct this question to you, my love. How would you define what yoga therapy is from your experience and all of your wonderful trainings that you explained to us?
I would say yoga therapy is using all the traditional qualities of yoga, so the yoga that we're all very familiar with, whether that's just the asana or the pranayama, so all 8 limbs of yoga, but combining it with other practices in the kind of psychology, mental health, coaching and neuroscience practices, and bringing those all together to focus on a specific need of an individual that is either physical, emotional or mental. And then the other thing I would say is it involves people and therapists that are trained in a specific way to keep the individual or the group safe, to go deeper.
Brilliant, thank you, Charlie. And Steph, I'll just spotlight your video, my love. And if you could give us your definition of what yoga therapy is from your experience and background.
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously very much echoing what Charlie has said, it's very much about the applied nature of yoga, and in the application of yoga as a tool, it's about using yoga to treat mental health difficulties, physical health conditions, or any other sort of symptoms, symptomology, difficulties that someone is living with in order to overcome those difficulties, to come into harmony more. Yoga therapy looks at both the psychology and the physiology. So the physiology being the body, like the nervous system, immunity, stress response, heart rate rhythm, digestion, all of that stuff, as well as the psychology being the emotions, so the thought processes, the behavior patterns, and almost marrying those two together. So yoga therapy, when you marry those things together, is about healing. And it's again, echoing Charlie and what she said about almost is applied to the individual, almost to treat. So to treat whatever's going on for them. It could be applied in a clinical setting, i.e. if someone has a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, or it could be for anyone that is struggling in some way. But the main component is about applying the aspects of yoga for the purpose of healing.
Thank you guys for those definitions. And I would probably describe yoga therapy from my experience as teaching it specifically for the aid of anxiety. Definitely mirroring exactly as you said, but as a way of combining all of those holistic elements and bringing them together. So I think even though we often in the West see yoga as sometimes being specifically focused on the asana, so the physical shapes and movements that we're making with the body. I think yoga as a therapeutic practice really brings together all the elements of yoga and the benefits that it can have on our mental health, as well as our physical health and emotional health. So I think yoga therapy from my experience of practicing it personally and teaching it, is really a way of bringing all of those tools and techniques together to help support the person receiving the yoga therapy. So it's a really, really powerful technique, I think, once you start practicing it. And it can have such a great impact on your mental health, your holistic health, and your well-being as a whole, as well. So our second topic is focusing on what the difference is between yoga and yoga therapy, which I suppose I just started to touch on. And I think this is something that is really important to demystify, actually, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about yoga and yoga therapy, find it quite hard to actually define the difference between the two. So I'll start with you again, Charlie, if that's okay. I'll just move your video onto the screen. There we go. So what would you describe as the difference between yoga and yoga therapy?
I'd say there's like a few specific kind of like, if I had bullet points in my head, the first would be to maybe just take the word that Steph used, which was to treat. So that's quite a key difference in that when you're practicing, the yoga that we're all familiar with, that is maybe just meditation, some reflection practice and breathing techniques and the movement, that tends to be based on what the individual wants to get out of that practice. Whereas yoga therapy tends to be specific, well, it is specific to treat something that the individual wants to work on. They come with that goal, they come with that desire to achieve. So to treat. The second thing I'd say is it's specific, not general, hence why you treat something. It tends to be individual or small groups instead of larger groups, which then moves into it's close, not distant. So it's very close between the individuals. So you're trying to really get to know what that person is facing to get through those barriers, whether they're emotional, physical, or mental, to treat, rather than, a lot of the time, some people want to be left on their mat in their own space, not necessarily touched or even adjusted. And then the final thing I'd say is the training. So people who teach yoga therapy have a very different training to if you're just teaching yoga, which is kind of what Steph was touching on, which is how to keep someone safe, how to do talking therapy, how to apply the physiology side and the psychology side that Steph has more experience in. But I think that is quite a key difference, is what you're trained in to offer. It's quite different.
Brilliant, thank you, Charlie. And I completely mirror what you're saying there. I think especially with yoga becoming such a huge thing in the West now, and it's absolutely huge in London and beyond, outside of big cities. It's becoming such a huge thing for people to help support themselves. And I think the difference really between going to, and we will actually get into the difference between group and smaller yoga therapy practices in a later discussion this evening, is the difference between going to a yoga class and expecting, a specific routine, a vinyasa, a hatha, whatever the discipline is that you're doing in that classroom, as opposed to yoga therapy, which, as we're beginning to describe, is a much more therapeutic-led approach to yoga and healing. I think much more based on what that particular person or that smaller group of people need from that practice. Steph, I will lead over to you now and just spotlight your video. Perfect. So if you are happy to just describe to us how would you define the difference between yoga and yoga therapy from your work?
Really, really good question, because so many people are intrigued, but then they don't know what it is or what it looks like. And I very much describe it as a continuum. So let's say you have yoga therapy at one end, yoga in the middle, and then talking therapy at the other. And it's almost like you slide along that continuum depending on what you want and need at that time. So let's say someone is struggling with depression or anxiety, feeling low, feeling overwhelmed, and they go to talking therapy. And there's no body-based movement involved in that. It's about the verbalization of thoughts and feelings. You go to a yoga class and maybe the purpose of starting yoga is because your GP says yoga's good for lower back pain. But you go to the class, you show up, you're taught, you're instructed, you're guided, but you are an individual that's told or encouraged how to move your body. Then with yoga therapy, the whole discipline is that it encourages a lot more self-inquiry. Okay, so what are my sensations? Where am I experiencing them? How am I experiencing them? What happens when I send my breath there? What does that shape feel like? And it's much more explorative. From a therapeutic stance with yoga therapy, it works with the symptoms as they are. So if we're looking at lower back pain, it's okay, well today, you know, I've got a sharp, intense or a dull ache around this area. But the difference between yoga therapy and talking therapies is that yoga therapy doesn't go into the story. So it wouldn't ask, okay, the yoga therapy, the lower back pain is related to stress, which happened after childhood trauma, for example. So yoga therapy doesn't go into the story like psychology or talking therapy would. It treats the symptoms as they are right here. Another factor with yoga therapy is that it's a complementary and alternative medicine, but it's not, for example, the only treatment depending on someone's need, which means as a yoga therapist, you may need to liaise with, for example, the GP, or if you're working with someone with complex trauma, you would want them to already be in talking therapy, and the yoga therapy is working alongside as a complement to that. And then another difference with yoga therapy is that we work with something called the kosher model. So in yoga philosophy, we understand the human experience on 5 different layers, from the outer shell to the inner shell. And yoga therapy uses the kosher model of these 5 layers almost as an assessment tool. Like, well, what's someone's diet? What's someone's movement? What's their level of fitness? What's their heart rate? How are they breathing? What's their digestion? What's the emotional quality? What are their thinking processes? What's their belief system about spirituality or not? Where do they find joy? And you use the kosher model as an assessment tool to then guide your intervention in yoga therapy. So even though yoga in itself can be informed by that approach, yoga therapy is using the kosher model to treat and heal and work with the individual.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Charlie. I wanted to just share a quick reading from one of my training manuals that I always come back to and refer to when I'm teaching. And I did my training with the Mind Institute, who many of you may have heard of, a really fantastic company in London where a lot of yoga therapists train under Heather Mason, who's the founder. And they have an explanation about what yoga therapy is, which I think gives a really great definition of how it can be understood as differing from yoga and yoga therapy. By most accounts, Swami Kuvalananda pioneered yoga therapy in the early 1920s, applying the methods of modern medical science to study the physiological effects and therapeutic application of yoga. By measuring the specific physiological effects of yoga, it became possible to offer prescriptions of practices for specific ailments. For example, when we understand the basic pathology of high blood pressure and we understand the role of breathing in relationship to high blood pressure, we can prescribe relevant breathing practices that will have a definite effect. Hence, yoga therapy differs from yoga in that it specifically targets a physical or physiological problem, and the assessment of the problem is perceived, at least in part, from a modern medical perspective. And additionally, as yoga therapy integrates the medical model into its conception of well-being, practices lend themselves to scientific investigation and repeatable results. Consequently, yoga therapists are able to prescribe effective healing practices based on scientific understanding and do not need to be fully enlightened in order to offer counsel, as well as traditional Indian practice. So I think it's think it's important to understand the difference between yoga and yoga therapy and how they can differ. And I think in the work that Charlie, me and Steph all do, they are working towards different areas of mental health and physical health. For my work, it's definitely specifically geared towards anxiety. And I know, Steph, your work is much broader with different areas of well-being, if I'm right. I'll just unmute you, Steph. Oh, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Distracted, there was a dog barking in the background.
Oh, don't worry. I was just saying that when with kind of that definition between yoga and yoga therapy, with my work with yoga therapy for anxiety, I'm working towards a kind of very specific area. I only really work with people who suffer with anxiety, and the different kind of physiological symptoms around that as well. Do you find that you're working with quite a broad spectrum of ailments that people come to you with?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question, because, you know, a key question about who is yoga therapy for, and, you know, anybody and everybody, because we all have a body. And what I really advocate for someone, you know, whether you're a yoga teacher and someone says, I can't touch my toes, I'm not flexible enough for yoga, or someone's like, oh, yoga therapy, what's that? That's not for me. Essentially, if you have a body and you have a breath, you can access yoga or yoga therapy at some level. And I mean, this is another kind of story to go down, but that's why I think our dominant narratives and culture and social media doesn't advocate that around what yoga is and who it's for. In terms of yoga therapy and who I work with, some of my clients recently, to give an example, a lady, mid-30s, single parents, some OCD type tendencies as a response to stress, and a lot of her work was actually around sitting still and being able to tolerate the difficult feelings of her separation from her partner and the feelings that surface go around loneliness, and actually allowing herself to not respond to, oh, I feel a negative emotion, I'll tidy my sock drawer, instead actually being able to sit and bear and witness and feel that loneliness. Completely different client. I've worked recently with a man in his late 50s who has a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease and epilepsy. So the work looked entirely different. It was very much about functional movement, building new neural pathways through repetitive movements, finding ways to live with and not control, but be mindful and aware of, for example, the shakes and the tremors that happen in Parkinson's disease. So this is a real example of how yoga therapy is tailored to meet the individual need. And bearing in mind the kosher model, for some people that might be speaking at more of an emotional level, like I'm really struggling with feeling lonely. Someone else, it might be, well, I'm living with a condition where my right hand shakes, so I'd like to, you know, find ways to build my motor control. So it's really, really entirely varied. And I am aware that sometimes it's like, oh, it's for anybody and everybody. But like Charlie said, it's about the specifics and sort of individual plan about what yoga therapy can offer for whom.
Thank you. Charlie, I'm just going to move over to your screen and open up the same question to you. What kind of clients do you tend to work with your branch of yoga therapy and in your work?
On a one-to-one level, so through private, it would be very similar to Steph, but through like less of a clinical application. So people who have a goal that they really want to work on personally. So I have a lady that I work with who has a child with leukemia who is very young and has to juggle being able to kind of handle this crazy world, support her other children and run her own business. And therefore it kind of is a lot to deal with overwhelm and stress. And she wanted to just be met from like a physical side of things, meaning I want to get into my body and work through that stress, but I want to start that from my body without having to go like Steph did down that spectrum straight into talking therapy, and a group class isn't giving me enough. And so it was that really nice medium where, you know, we don't have to speak for the first couple of sessions for her to really get into her body. And then another private client would be someone who maybe doesn't have that level of kind of stress and life challenges in their view, but they want to work on their confidence and the way that they display themselves, and they don't necessarily to know how to do that, and maybe coaching isn't enough. And I can use yoga therapy as a way to kind of get into the way they hold their body and the way they present themselves to create an opening into that confidence. So you can still get into more complex issues like something like confidence that is without having to sort of teach somebody ways to talk. And then the other side, so that's like the private one-to-one side. The other side is I do a lot of things in small groups or in the corporate background. I wouldn't use necessarily yoga therapy in the corporate background, but in small groups you can come together, work through different practices, and then I would kind of provide a practice and say what this practice is designed to help. And then the individual can decide how they apply that to their life, and they can kind of add it to their toolkit and kind of pick and choose what practices that they know go paired with a certain maybe imbalance or a mental emotional state, and then they can use that in their own way through their life without kind of going really deep. So that's kind of the difference for my one-to-ones and my smaller group kind of less detailed clients.
Definitely. And that leads us on to one of our topics of discussion, which is going to be about if there is a big difference to practicing yoga therapy in a group versus as a one-to-one practitioner. And Charlie, you teach our group elemental yoga therapy class at More Yoga under our MoreMind program, which is a new class that we've only been offering for, I think, about a month now. How would you kind of describe the difference between practicing yoga therapy on a one-to-one basis with a practitioner versus a group? I suppose if anyone has joined who might be interested in having yoga therapy one-to-one, or is perhaps thinking about joining a group session to see if it's right for them, how would you describe the main difference? Obviously you get a much more personal approach one-to-one.
Yeah, so exactly. Say aside from the obvious, which you get more personal, you also don't go as deep because you can't hold that safe space in a group setting. But in a group setting, what I would tend to do is kind of make it more theory-based. So I would provide, say, which I know we'll talk about later, but I use elemental yoga therapy. So I use the 5 elements, which I guess is similar to the coaching model, but I use the 5 elements that pair with certain mental imbalances or physical imbalances. So then in a group setting, I would say, right, so today we're going to be working on, say, the earth element and what yoga therapy is applied to for that. I'd then talk about certain imbalances in that element. So let's say the different spectrum of that imbalance. If you've got too much of this specific feeling or too little of this specific feeling, there's a few things that you can do to bring yourself into that balance. And then I'd walk through a particular yoga practice using a combination of acupressure and a certain breathing exercise that would work on that particular imbalance. So they kind of have that theory to write down and a practice to write down, then they can pick and choose to add to their own life. The difference on a one-to-one level is you have that goal. So you are treating a specific thing. So you meet that person on that level of what they're trying to get through, and those practices will move and change depending on what you're noticing in that person.
Thank you. And Steph, I'm going to swap over to your screen. Panel discussions are interesting when we're online. Let's focus on that topic now, because we're already discussing it. So how would you describe the big difference between the one-to-one yoga therapy and having it in a group? Because obviously there are specific things that you can focus on in a group, and one-to-one it's much more private and personal. Would you kind of advise people to try a group class first and then maybe see how it works for them before moving to a one-to-one?
I was thinking about this earlier, and again, there was a total mirroring between the practices of yoga therapy and psychological therapy, in that maybe the sort of intention is the same, but the application and delivery is different. And there's benefits to both. It's just about what speaks to what will support the individual more at that time. So to echo some of Charlie's comments, of course, if you're working one-to-one, you can go deeper. It's an individualized plan. You can support more self-inquiry because you get to know the person in that therapeutic relationship in which you're working directly with them. There might be more therapeutic dialogue, like, for example, I've noticed a change in your breath when you move to that posture, and you might inquire about safety, for example. And that sort of personal or individual inquiry, you wouldn't necessarily be able to facilitate in the group. So the dynamics are different, but as Charlie said, it's about holding the safe space and container, so for everybody to feel safe and at ease. So for example, in running a yoga therapy group, so I'm trained in running an 8-week course for people struggling with anxiety and depression in yoga therapy, and we go through a different theme each week, and there's a set sequence, there's home practices, there's psychoeducation, there's learning about the sort of body-based movement as well as the meditation and the breathing. But what groups do really promote is that sense of social support. So we know from research that social isolation, the irony of 2020, but let's not go there, has detrimental effects for our mental health. So social inclusion, contact with other people, promotes our sense of of mental and emotional well-being. So when you turn up to a therapy group, it can be massively overwhelming, like, oh gosh, everyone here is going to know that, I struggle with X, Y, Z, or what if I'm the odd one out, or what if no one likes me? All of those inner critic, negative thoughts that typically everyone in the room will have. What is really powerful about groups, again, yoga therapy, psychology therapy, whatever the nature is the power of peer support. So the nature is, someone else feels like this too. I'm not the only one. And then, there's an opportunity to build that social connection with others. And it makes you feel, or it can encourage you to feel not alone in your experience. So again, there's benefits of both, but it's about what will support the individual at that time.
Thank you. I think it's definitely important for anyone who is listening with the intention of perhaps exploring yoga therapy for themselves. I think joining a group class is a really nice way to see if it is for you. From my experience of working with people one-to-one and in smaller groups, as I think we've all described, normally tends to be the setting for yoga therapy groups. They don't tend to be large groups that I've personally experienced before. They tend to be smaller groups of people, perhaps working towards the same goal. Within my work, that's always around anxiety and managing and alleviating symptoms of anxiety and experiences of anxiety. So I think often the difference is having that one-to-one experience. And as I think that, how you described it, Steph, that sliding scale of somewhere yoga therapy is between the movement asana-based yoga classes, in the middle of that one-to-one kind of talking therapy that you might get working with a therapist. I think that's a really lovely definition of seeing it as somewhere in between. And in terms of the benefits of these different types of yoga therapy that we're talking about this evening, some of the benefits that I find and I offer to my clients through my work is obviously the alleviation of symptoms of anxiety. And that can span from anywhere from the emotional effects of anxiety and stress on you emotionally, the mental effects of anxiety, and the physiological effects. So I think what I think and why I'm so passionate about my work in yoga therapy is that yoga therapy really does treat a person as a whole. It treats whatever you're going through on a very holistic level. And as someone who has anxiety myself, hence working in it, I know that anxiety tends to occur quite physiologically. So we'll have a reaction to it in the body. I can see a few people nodding. So actually, one of the best things when you're anxious, rather than having to sit still and talk to somebody for an hour, and if anyone's ever experienced that kind of talking therapy, you might have found that emotions might come up in another way. You might burst out crying, you might have a panic attack, and actually getting onto the mat and physically moving to move some of those emotions can be really, really helpful at getting you into a healthier place to then explore what is going on in your body and in your mind. So that physical based nature of yoga therapy, I think, can actually have such a calming effect on the practitioner, on the person who's doing the yoga therapy, as well as obviously some of those things like mindfulness, helping us to become more present in ourselves, breathing practices, pranayama, helping us to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and relax the body, as well as obviously those other physical benefits that yoga offer us, reducing stress, improving flexibility of mind as well as body. Charlie, would you like to just explain briefly, because I know we are rapidly running out of time, which is terrifying. We could talk about this all night. Just some of the benefits let's talk about elemental yoga therapy, as I know that's your specialism, and some of the benefits of that amazing sounding practice. I can't wait to try it one day.
Yes, well, I guess in a way, like very similar to what you said, in, moving from the physical, and it's a very holistic approach. One of the things that is very similar to traditional or elemental yoga therapy that you two both teach is this getting you to being self-sufficient. So I think one of the big benefits is you're not just relying heavily on, say, talking therapy and working with that person who's really allowing you to release that emotion and that pain from your body through those questions and that talking. It's quite reliant, or maybe on medication down the other end. One of the benefits of yoga therapy is it's teaching you these practices, these tools and techniques, this self-exploration that Steph was talking about, to allow you to be self-sufficient. So you kind of get more into your own space and more into your own body to be able to control your different levels of imbalances. Another one of the benefits I feel, and I feel like I've, also benefited from with elemental yoga therapy is, yes, it's to treat, like we've kind of said a lot, but you don't have to have a specific problem or mental health illness or disorder, let's say. Mental health is a spectrum, and we do all move up and down it, mentally well, mentally unwell, and we don't have to fall into the level of illness. And what I quite like about using elemental yoga therapy is we all have low moods, we all have high moods, and it's just a nice way to move through the natural, difficult navigation of life, and it's a very accessible type of practice to get into. And then the last benefit I'd probably say is it can still create change. So you don't have to, you can apply it to other things. Maybe, other people need to use medication for whatever reason, but you can use elemental therapy to actually create change in your life.
Thank you, Charlie. And Steph, I will just swap over to your screen, my love. If there's anything you'd like to add about the benefits of yoga therapy as a therapeutic tool.
I think it's really important to speak to the inclusivity about it. And again, that's such a bigger topic than what we can go into this evening, but lots of complaints about the yoga world in our Western society is that it's not inclusive. And actually you only have to look around any studio and the yoga classes to see that. And actually the more that we can use yoga as a tool to offer to anybody and everybody as a healing practice in the way that it will speak to them and their needs is really, really important. The getting to know yourself through yoga therapy, whether it's your body, whether it's your mind, is a hugely powerful practice. We are so disconnected. We are, as a society, as individuals, we typically live in our heads, which is, wonderful, because we can be these intelligent, thinking, planning, worrying human beings. But actually, the body is much older than the mind, and yoga therapy is an opportunity to really learn how to listen to what your body is telling you, all of those different signals. And by applying the skills in yoga therapy, you can start to become more aware of thought processes, interrupt negative thinking patterns, shape and change behaviours, build your emotional resilience by working at the level of your nervous system. So literally using tools from yoga therapy to calm and quiet your nervous system to build up the relaxation response. And as Charlie was saying, it's about empowerment and self-help. So these are skills that you learn, and you learn for life.
Thank you, Steph. I can't believe how quickly this time has flown tonight. We're coming on to our last topic though, which is great, and we'll still have 10 minutes to open up for any questions that anybody might have at the end of our discussion. So the last point I wanted us to focus on was any advice that you would give someone interested in perhaps getting involved in yoga therapy for themselves, or interested in training in yoga therapy. I've mentioned already, I did my training at the Minded Institute and would highly recommend them as a body to study with. They run some excellent short courses specifically on different areas of mental health and well-being. They also run longer courses that I know, Steph, you're just coming towards the end of, or just finishing up your yoga therapy training. And I would definitely advise looking into their website and researching there. They're one of our partners at More Yoga as well. So we highly recommend their work. Charlie, I will just move on to you for this last topic, and we've probably just got a few moments to discuss this.
I would say, if you're training wise, if you're looking to move into training, again, Minded Institute, definitely look at, lean on people that you know. So us three here, we're accessible to talk to and reach out to if you have questions, and then maybe think about what you're looking to achieve, or think about what your training already is. So what have you already got in your background, in your toolkit, that you could add to? So maybe start small. If you feel like you're already a strong practitioner as a teacher, maybe do a couple of courses. If you feel like you've done a lot of research, maybe head straight into a bigger kind of full yoga therapy training. So kind of think about what you want to achieve. Then as a practice, I guess it's hard because, like Steph said, it's about it being inclusive and accessible. So really, it can be for anything. It could be if there's something really at the moment that you're really struggling with, that you really want to tackle, and you haven't really been able to achieve it, and you haven't been able to figure out what the right medium to use is. Maybe yoga therapy is the way to go, and it's something you can try. But at the same time, if you don't feel like there's something alarming that you're struggling with, but you do have these fluctuations, and another thing I want to echo that Steph said, and you want to get to know yourself better, you want to understand yourself more in the environment that we survive in, yoga therapy is a beautiful practice for that, because you allow that self-expression. So there's lots of different ways to look at it. It's not a very direct answer, but there you go.
Thank you, Charlie. Steph, I'll just move onto your video, my love, if you're happy to just offer any advice to anyone interested in practicing yoga therapy for themselves, or training in yoga therapy from your experience.
Yeah, it's making me think of a reflection that I had personally a couple of days ago, and I was journaling, and I was thinking about what yoga has brought me. And yes, I'm reflecting on yoga as a whole, not specifically yoga therapy, but it's aligned. And it's that yoga gave me the opportunity to connect with an emotional experience that I couldn't yet put words to. What I'm talking about is in my mid-20s, when I sort of found and discovered and connected to yoga. Yoga was healing me in a way that I was unconscious of. And then through that healing, I was then able to go and have talking therapy for what I needed. So yoga was working for me on a level of healing. So anyone that wants to practice yoga therapy, I would very much encourage you to be looking at a directory of yoga therapists. For example, on the Minded Institute website, there is a directory of people that qualified. it's hard to find a therapist, and this is coming from a point of view of a psychologist who's previously looked at their own therapy. When you think, oh, you know, who do I go for, and like who will speak to me the most, think about what your values are, what's important to you, who you want to work with. Do you want to be matched by someone by their skills, their education? Essentially, it's important to feel safe, so you're in a trusted and held environment, and just try it out, really. In terms of training, I think two of the leading training institutes, sorry, there's some background conversation, I hope that's not coming through. Sorry. So there's two leading schools to train with in London. That's the Minded Institute and Yoga Campus, but there's also lots of other yoga therapy training institutes across the world. What else is important to know? Talk to other people that have received yoga therapy. Talk to people that are training in yoga therapy. If you're thinking about training in it, look at the curriculum and the sort of the philosophies, the values of each training program. Commitment, look at the time. As Charlie said, look at your existing toolbox and how you can build on it. Read the books, watch the talks, reach out to us. There's lots of ways to sort of source the information, and I think now this is like a golden nugget where, you know, you can
I understand. You can grow from there. Thank you, Charlie and Steph, for sharing your insights on yoga therapy and demystifying a little bit about this kind of new and growing world that is available to all of us. And Charlie, you have a class on the MoreMind schedule on Thursdays at 12 o'clock, if I'm correct.
It is 12:45, nearly.
That is elemental yoga therapy. That's on our online More Yoga schedule. So if anyone is looking to try a group class, that is one way to join a class and maybe see how you experience yoga therapy. And Steph, we have your upcoming 6-week course that is starting in October, that's going to include yoga therapy focused on compassion.
Yeah, do you want me to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that would be great. And then we'll open up, we have 10 minutes left, so we can then open up just for some questions if anyone has any burning topics to discuss.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So there is a course I'm running for a 5-week online program, and it's using yoga and psychology from the perspective of compassion focused therapy. So it's a 5-week online course. Each session is 2 hours. The first hour will be a sharing of compassion focused therapy. So there'll be education where you learn about the model. There'll be reflective writing practices, group sharing if you want to. But essentially what compassion focused therapy does is help you to identify your inner critic and to look at the different ways your systems work. So what motivates you, what are you fearful of, and how do you soothe yourself? So through this, we learn practices in identifying thought patterns, changing behaviours, building up the things that will soothe us and relax us to catch out that inner critic and build up kinder and calmer ways of being with ourselves. So that will be the first hour of the course, and the second hour of the course will be a yoga therapy practice that's linked into what we've been learning. So essentially this is a course to help you to build up your sort of self-soothing toolkit and find ways to overcome the inner critic. So using both yoga and psychology. There is an early bird price at the moment, which you'll find on the More Yoga website, or you can contact me directly. We'll share the contacts at the end of the session.
Thank you. So I will just open up now. Thank you both so much for sharing those insights. I think the best way for us to do this, guys, is if anyone has any questions, to just type them into the chat channel, just to avoid people talking over each other. If there are any burning questions or any topics that anyone would like a little bit more information about, perhaps, if you'd like to just jot those in the chat channel, I can read them out and we'll do our best to answer those. from our different levels of experience and our different areas of the yoga therapy that we work within. Often in these sessions, people are reluctant to ask questions. So we'll see. If anyone does have any questions, though, that you would like us to just discuss a little bit more about, just pop those in the chat. Cool, thank you, John. So what are the prerequisites for starting a course? Do you have to be a yoga teacher? So do you mean for joining, taking part in the course that Steph was talking about? Yeah, no, the course is available for anybody, if I'm right, Steph. It's a training course, it's for personal development.
Do you mean the sort of diploma in yoga therapy, John?
Ah, yes, sorry.
Training, yeah, with the Mind. So I trained with the Minded Institute, and it's a 550-hour training. You don't have to be a yoga teacher prior to training, but as a sort of solid yoga practice is encouraged. So, for example, 3/4 of my cohort out of 36 people, I would say, were yoga teachers. Some weren't, and that wasn't a problem. Everyone finishes at the same level in some way in regards to yoga therapy. Those that weren't yoga teachers have already extensive backgrounds in education, healthcare, any other sort of complementary sort of health and wellness practice. So yeah, you don't have to be. It is quite common for people to be, but you're not at a disadvantage if you're not, because there's like a top up of yoga teaching skills. You learn the skills throughout the course. Can you hear the dog?
Only just. It's keeping things interesting. Layers. Thank you, Steph.
Your question. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I would just mirror that to say, I think often it tends to work one way. I think either yoga teachers become yoga therapists, or people study yoga therapy and then often want to do more study into yoga teaching specifically. I know from my experience, once you start learning about yoga and well-being, you can never stop learning. It's one of those, the gift that keeps on giving. There's always more you can learn, and more you can develop, and different skills you can grow into. So I think it's actually a really exciting space to be working in at the moment as well, within yoga therapy and well-being, as it feels quite new and still a very exciting area where all these things are being linked together. And yoga, that I think used to be seen in quite a different light than how it is seen today, is being taken much more seriously for its benefits and therapeutic benefits, and how it can be used as a therapeutic tool. And I know it's starting to, through actually a lot of the work that Heather Mason's doing with the NHS, it's starting slowly to become prescribed as from GPs. I think very slowly they're starting to prescribe yoga as something that you can use as an alternative tool to medication, or a beneficial tool on top of medication. So it's a really exciting time to be working in this industry and moving into this area, as it's I think just growing exponentially in the way that it can help people. Marta, thank you for your question. How has your work as therapists changed in the past few months without being able to offer hands-on assistance for people with physical needs, or close contact for those with emotional needs? Seems like those are quite crucial to yoga therapy versus yoga, where verbal cues and Zoom are kind of enough. Thank you. Really, really wonderful question, actually. It's interesting, actually. I thought my work would become much more challenging, and actually I'm working much more than I was before. So I imagine that's because I'm sure everyone knows we're on the brink of a mental health crisis at the moment, with so many people suffering with anxiety, heightened experiences of depression, with stress, with all kinds of mental illnesses due to the effects of COVID-19 and what it's done to us as individuals, the economy, and broader in terms of the world, and so much change. So I think at the moment, a lot of people need a lot more support than they did before. Everything happened in March this year. Everything suddenly changed, and I think the way that I've been working, which before that I'd never worked online. I did everything one-to-one and in person or in groups. I'd never actually done anything on Zoom pre-March this year, and it's actually amazing how much you can put through a screen. I think as long as you can see someone's body, you can give them cues, and I think working therapeutically with people, you maybe have to work a bit harder and be a bit more dynamic in your approach. But I have found that actually there are ways to bring in all of those elements together, and still be able to offer people different tools and techniques through yoga therapy that can benefit them without using touch. And I'm a very tactile teacher. I love offering hands-on adjusts. And for me, that's always been a really soothing tool to offer people that physical support while you're teaching them. And I think it's about being really dynamic in your approach, and learning to work in different ways. Charlie, how have you found it's affected your work?
I realise I'm just getting darker because I've not moved and the light didn't work. So, you might just be able to see my teeth. I look like Ross from Friends. So good, really good question, and similar to you, but I would say I've had to spend a little bit more time getting to know the client. So I've had to do a bit more talking at the beginning, and more traditional yoga practices where I'm not going too deep into pairing it with the imbalances, just to take some time to get to know each other a little more without having that kind of non-verbal cue and that communication. So it's been a slightly longer process, or starting more in the gross rather than the subtle, so a lot more in the physical body. But I agree, you can still provide people safety and the cues, as long as you kind of set it up well enough. So, let them know what they need, how they need their space to be set up, how you're going to show up, so that they know what to expect in that space. Because otherwise it can be easy to kind of shortcut and just find a little corner, and they don't get that same kind of connection that they get when you create that space. So I kind of give them a bit of advice on how to set their space up, so that you're still providing a safe and kind of sacred space.
Thank you, Charlie.
I'm going to move inside now.
Brilliant. We've only got a few minutes left, just so everyone knows. Steph, how have you found that it's affected your work? I mean, on both levels, as a psychologist and as a yoga therapist.
Yeah. Different, very, very different, but very doable still. So in terms of yoga therapy, if you're particularly working with trauma, touch is something that you would use a lot less anyway. There's much more of an ethical debate around the use of touch and consent, and like Charlie said about getting to know your client more, that's really, really required. Online, of course, there's not the use of touch, and you might be limited to what you can see on the screen. So you do lose an essence of, the practicalities. I can see someone from the waist up, and I can't see if their foot is tapping in nervousness, for example. There are body language cues which are lost, but it also brings a different element. So people might feel more comfortable to open up when it's online. There's more sort of, navigation of the space, because whether you're a psychologist, yoga therapist, whatever therapist, and you are the client on the other end, there's this landing. So this idea of zooming in and zooming out, you're landing into each other's space. And that requires real work in the therapeutic relationship. What are we navigating here? And actually, in the same way that all of us are zooming in from all over the world, we are landing in each other's space, and we zoom in and we zoom out. So actually, how do we navigate that? And that really speaks to the therapeutic relationship, the rapport that you build, and how you build safety.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph, for sharing so much this evening to both of you. We are 1 minute over 7 o'clock, so I think we've done quite well to squeeze in all those questions. And what I will do is I'll share the contact details of myself, Steph and Charlie with everyone who's registered for this event, so that everyone has an opportunity to get in touch if there's anything personal that you would like to ask, or any topics or questions that you think about later on after this call. And we'll also share a recorded version of this session and some information about the classes and Steph's course as well, just for anyone who's interested. But this is something that we're really wanting to grow at More Yoga. Our MoreMind program is very, very close to all of our hearts, and a real opportunity to help support each other, because we need to come together at this time, right? More than ever. We need to really support each other in every way that we can, and that's something that we feel really strongly about at More Yoga. So if you have any questions or anything that I can help with, please feel free to drop me an email directly. It's liz@moreyoga.co.uk, and I would love to connect off Zoom with everyone as well. But I'll unmute everyone just so we can say goodbye. Sorry, Steph.
Before we finish, it would be really lovely to hear from people just before you zoom out. Just drop a line in the chat to say either something that you've learned today, something to take away, something that's inspired you. Not necessarily as feedback, but more about your own message. Like, what have you showed up for and what are you taking away from today?
Yeah, that's a lovely idea.
It's really important for us to know what speaks to you, and that will help us guide also what we continue to offer. So just have a little think and maybe drop something in the chat about something you're taking away, whether it's personal, professional, something new.
Yeah, a word. Cool. Thank you, Amanda. Great to learn more about this field. Definitely a direction I want to go in. Interesting, but it's also overlapping with where I feel I'm heading with my teaching. Wonderful. Sam, understanding. Thank you. Marta, found it really interesting that yoga therapy treats the symptoms as they are without delving into the past histories. Interesting. Thank you guys for your comments. Julia, I've become really interested in dealing with trauma and depression through full body work, and have been finding slower yoga practice, elemental yoga, a really soothing practice and complementary to talking therapy. Thank you for sharing. Really, really interesting.
It's so good to hear.
Yeah, no, it's really wonderful. I think we were all quite blown away by the response we got to doing this this session, because it obviously is a relatively new area of well-being. So it's wonderful that everyone has joined. Thank you so much for sharing this evening with us, guys, and for giving us your time and energy tonight as well. I'll just read off these last few comments before we leave. Rosie, it's been really refreshing to know this change is happening. I am a therapist with a master's in health psychology and a trained yoga therapist, and really want to get into body work in unison with therapy. Lovely. And John, thank you so much. That was very informative. I thought the sliding scale to treat different people was great. Yeah, I loved that. Thank you so much, Steph. And thank you so much, Charlie, for both of you joining us from different parts of the world. I feel like I should be somewhere exotic. I'm just in my flat in London. I will just mute everybody so we can say goodbye, guys, but look out for my email tomorrow. I'll just send some things around, and do feel free to write back and get in touch. It's so important that we all stay as connected as we can at the moment, even though we are physically a little bit more distance than we might like to be. Cool, so I will just unmute everybody so we can say goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much
Good to meet you all.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, guys. Have a lovely evening on this warm Monday night in London. Probably a bit warmer where you are, Charlie and Steph. Bye, John. Bye, Sam. Bye.